Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. I'm Fabienne Hara. I'm the Deputy Director of the Paris Peace Forum. And I want to extend a warm welcome to my 4 panelists on stage. Today, we're going to focus on the UN Summit for the Future. It's a very intriguing concept and a very intriguing title for a UN summit. And I hope that today's discussion is going to help us understand better what this is about. Of course, a lot of people are asking questions about the UN Summit for the Future. Why a summit for the future and not a summit for the present? Earlier today, Hassan Salameh was saying we need a summit for the present because we have not reached the SDGs yet. So there's still a lot of work to do in terms of development. In terms of peace and security, we have wars going on, like the one in Israel and Gaza, and the Security Council is paralyzed, not able to call for a ceasefire. We have a UN security member from the P5, Russia, turning against the UN Charter. We have a number of UN peacekeeping missions that are experiencing what we call an obsolescing welcome. and the stabilization operations are failing to an extent. Some of the world leaders did not even come to the UN General Assembly in last September. So first of all, we have a lot of questions to discuss, but I'm joined by an extremely distinguished panel. Mr. Guy Ryder, Under-Secretary General for Policy in the Executive Office of the Secretary General. Mr. Alain Leroy, former United Nations Under-Secretary General for Peacekeeping Operations. Mr. Dino Patijalal, who is the founder and president of the Foreign Policy Community of Indonesia, a think tank. And Tolu Ogunlesi, director of WOW Media. So let me first turn to Guy Ryder. Mr. Ryder, can you explain to us what the summit, UN Summit for the Future is and what the challenges you face? What are the challenges you face?
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for that presentation. Let me just try and set the scene. The Summit for the Future will take place next September in the General Assembly at the level of heads of government, heads of state. The idea of the Summit of the Future really goes back to the 75th anniversary of the United Nations, when member states made firm commitments about the future of multilateralism and to multilateralism, statement of confidence in multilateralism. And they asked the Secretary General to present his proposals on how to strengthen multilateralism, how to re-dynamize it, how to modernize it, I think with 2 purposes in mind. One is to address the issues of the present, how to deliver on the Sustainable Development Goals. We're halfway through that story. Only 15%, that's 15% of the SDG targets are being met. So we're well behind. So the Summit of the Future is part acceleration of that, but it's also intended to try to address new and emerging issues, to make multilateralism respond better to the political realities of the moment and the emerging challenges that we face. So what's going to happen in September? The General Assembly has already decided that the aim of the summit will be to adopt a pact for the future with 5 chapters, 5 headings, 5 rubriques, if you like. One is sustainable development, delivering on the SDGs, with a particular accent on financing of sustainable development. So keep that idea in your head, because financing and reform of the international financial architecture is a big piece of the story. The second chapter will be peace and security. I'm going to defer to my neighbor on these areas, but the Secretary General is tabling a new agenda for peace to update the 1992 agenda for peace that Boutros Ghali put on the table. And this is to, again, deal with the changing nature of conflict and emerging threats to peace and security. Think of the application of new technologies, autonomous weapons, etc. The third chapter is about digital cooperation, science and technology. Here, the idea is to adopt a new global digital compact to ensure that the benefits of technology are maximized and fairly shared and the potential harms are eliminated. And of course, artificial intelligence looms large in this story, but it's only a part of the story. The fourth chapter is youth and future generations. Summit of the future, this sounds entirely logical. I think what we need to do for existing youth is one thing. What we need to do for the future generations, those 10 billion yet unborn who will be born before the end of the century, is important. We have to make sure that decisions taken today will reflect and respect the interests of those unborn generations. We hope to have a declaration on future generations as part of the pact. And the final chapter, I can say it in a word or two words, it's transforming governance. So if you think Security Council reform and a whole host of other things, this is about having our governance systems, again, reflect the world of 2023, 2024, and not, as is sometimes the case today, of 1945. And the last word, human rights, gender, these are to be cross-cutting issues throughout the pact. That's where we stand right now. The negotiating process is just starting, and we will have a lot of work to do between now and next September.
Thank you very much. Turning to you, Mr. Leroy, as a former Undersecretary General of Peacekeeping, you were there a few years ago, but how do you see the peace and security challenges evolving? How have they evolved in the last decade? And what is your assessment of the UN peacekeeping missions that you helped create? Do they address the issues on the ground? Do they have a transformative impact? What are the challenges? And what do you think of the new agenda for peace?
Thank you to you, and thank you for Guy Ryder for the explanation about the Summit for the Future. It's clear that the challenges in terms of peace and security are higher, much higher than before, especially during the time when I was in the UN. And we could say, some people said the UN are not at its best these days, such as multilateralism. It's confronted to many challenges. But first I want to say is that despite, I hear from time to time that in some places, including in peace and security, the UN is becoming somehow irrelevant. And I want to oppose this feeling completely, especially at a time where multilateralism and the UN are badly needed even more than before. When you see the challenges, more conflict than before. Then I read in a UN speech that there are more people killed in a conflict this year, the highest number since 28 years, the highest number of people dead in conflict. So challenge of conflict, challenge of climate, challenge of course, pandemic, so need for a stronger UN. And for that, clearly, so far, I consider that the UN has not really failed. Even when I hear sometimes the Ukraine has become irrelevant concerning Ukraine. For me, that is completely wrong. It's clear that the UN Security Council has been blocked by the Russian veto, and for sure about Ukraine, but first the General Assembly voted, and 141 votes condemning the Russian invasion is not only the West, it's much higher than that. Second, even concerning Ukraine, the UN is very much active. Of course, you have seen the UN Secretary General Mr. Guterres negotiating the grain deal together with Turkey. That was absolutely key. You see who is dealing with the IDPs in Ukraine and the refugees outside. It's the UNHCR. UN UNICEF is involved. When you speak about the power plant of Zaporizhzhia, who is involved? It's the IAEA, again, a UN agency. You have seen also the International Court of Justice, a UN body also intervene to condemn the invasion by Russia. So the UN remains extremely active and extremely useful. And for that, you mentioned about the peacekeeping operation. Again, I hear from time to time that they are criticized. At the same time, you can see how many millions of lives they have saved in the recent years. And for example, I have maybe one example a contrario. There was two peacekeeping missions, one specifically, one in Haiti and one in Darfur. They were both blocked, stopped in the year when, in fact, President Trump was in power in the US, both Haiti and Darfur. Both were functioning quite well. Now, when the mission stopped in Haiti, what happened? 2 years after the mission was stopped, the president of the Republic of Haiti was assassinated, and until today, Haiti is in a complete chaos. Okay. then you see a contrario different when the UN is there and when the UN is not there. Second, Darfur. There was a mission together from the UN and African Union in Darfur, and it was criticized, but still extremely useful. Today, the mission has been stopped, as I said a few years ago. And what is going? There is a war in Sudan. And if we had a mission in Darfur, many thousands of lives would have been protected during the war we have in Sudan. And now, completely against war in Sudan and terrible conflict within Darfur, ethnic conflict, because the UN was not there. And even today, last example, in Lebanon, of course, with Gaza, we have the mission called UNIFIL, which is at south of Lebanon, between the Lebanon and Israel. And since 2006, this mission has been key to prevent the eruption of a big war. Of course, today, if Iran and Hezbollah decide to launch a complete war against Israel, maybe the mission will not be able to stop. But this mission has been able to stop all the incidents which occur in the last 20 years. So lots of things to be done, but at the same time, it's important to review the way we operate, and it's why the Summit for the Future and the Future Pact for the Future is important. For example, I read that the UN Secretary General wants very much having more mission of peace enforcement, not only peacekeeping, and maybe giving that role to regional organizations such as African Union. And that's a very good way to discuss. And especially, for example, he has in mind, and France and made our support, to have a financing by the UN of African peace enforcement operation. It's a long time request from the African. I think it's a very valid point, and that will be discussed with many other points in the Summit for the Future. And the last point I want to say, to ensure those peacekeeping operations, the role of the UN, I always recall the Article 24 of the Charter. The UN has the primary responsibility for peace and security in the world. And of course, one of the main tools is a peacekeeping operation. But for this operation to be more legitimate, it's important that the Security Council is even more legitimate. And I think, my personal opinion, we shall use the opportunity of this summit next year with so many heads of states to finally find a solution on the enlargement of the Council. The question has been on the table for the last 20 years, but still it's impossible today not to have African permanent members and to enlarge to several countries. So we can discuss which country. France has some proposals on the G4. But that is important to use that opportunity to make a strong progress on that. And maybe the last point, if you have one more, is on the veto right. On the veto right, just on that, just to remember the figures. I checked the figure before coming. Russia, in fact, starting with Soviet Union and now Russia, they have used the veto 130 times since 1945. The US 88 times, China 18 times, UK 30 times, and France 18 times. Last time France used it alone was in 1976. But now the question is, there is a proposal on the table, both by Mexico and France, for self-limitation of the veto rights in case of mass atrocity. And this proposal has gained the support of over 106 countries these days. I think it's very important that we continue to have that. And I was glad to hear President Biden last year in his speech that he thinks himself or the US to refrain of the use of veto, not in all circumstances. We know there are some circumstances they will use it, in question of mass atrocities or in some cases like that. So I think it's a progress, and we hope, again, the summit could be an opportunity to progress on this field. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Lots of questions, follow-up questions for you afterwards. Dino, you're based in Indonesia. So what do you make of the geopolitical shifts that we've seen in the last few years? And as Mr. Ryder was saying just a few moments ago, how do we make the UN look like a 21st century organization, and how does it reflect the geopolitical shifts that we've seen so far, and how are the emerging powers relating to the UN as it is today, and what do they wish to see happen?
In 5 minutes?
In 5 minutes. 4, if you can.
Good. Well, first, with all the criticisms about the UN, there's simply no substitute for the UN. Yeah? There's no other institutions in the world, global institutions, that has the credibility, no matter how limited, and can deliver the kind of public goods that the UN has been able to deliver, as Alan has just said right now. I think the Summit of the Future will be a great opportunity to renew the sense of ownership of the international community towards the UN Charter, and multilateralism. And I must say it's important to do this because it's that countries have found other venues sometimes to serve their interests. Yeah. For example, there are countries who tend to rely on regional mechanisms. Indonesia on ASEAN, for example, who are seen to be, look, there are only 10 members there, and we can get things done in our region a lot faster, for example. Yeah. And for example, my president has not been to the UN UN General Assembly in 9 years, right? So that reflects something. Yeah. The fact that we need to renew the sense of ownership towards multilateralism and UN Charter. And as we renew our ownership, I think it's very important for the South to be a strong part of it, for the Global South. I know we talk a lot about the Global South in the Paris Peace Forum, but the Global South has become quite different today compared to 30 years ago. Yeah, I mean, for one thing, look, does anyone know who the chairman of the non-aligned movement is now? Right, non-aligned movement has somewhat lost steam, and it is no longer the engine of the Global South. Yeah, and secondly, Global South has gained a lot of sense of confidence and entitlement. Right, we don't like to be called a third world anymore. Right, because it implies if you're in a train, there's first-class passengers, second-class, and third-class passengers, and we don't want to be called third-class passengers, right? So the Global South need to be part of however the new multilateral system and UN reform that is being designed. And I'll tell you something, Fabian, there's a lot of perception, a lot of view in the Global South that they are not happy with the world order as it is now, simply because, one, they see that oftentimes it does not serve their interests, and secondly, it is implemented selectively, and there's a lot of double standards. And I think during the Gaza crisis, this perception has been enhanced. Yeah. So definitely, there's the case that the South needs to be part of this effort to redesign the UN system and make it more effective. And I think what is important is how do we address this north-south gap and sometimes resentments that exists today. Because if you want to reimagine the world anew and you want international cooperation, you want renewed trust, this gap between the North and the South must be addressed. The problem is very simple. A lot of countries in the Global South, when you ask them, are you happy with the world order? They will say no, right? But if you ask them, what do you want? How do you want it to be reformed? You got 100 different answers, right? You know, unlike in the 70s where you have this very clear demand about the new international economic order, such thing does not exist today, yeah? And the non-aligned movement, which was very active in the 70s and 80s, is not very active today. So it's a different terrain, and I do believe that middle powers like Indonesia, Brazil, Mexico, India. I know they don't like to be called middle power, but you know, they're part of BRICS and so on. Yeah, Nigeria, South Africa, Korea, yeah? Australia. A lot of these middle powers can help create space that would help shape the new multilateralism in the 21st century.
Thank you. Really interesting. Middle powers as mediators of the new global order. Tolu, you work in technology. You're one of the bright tech thinkers in Africa. And the Summit for the Future, the Pact for the Future, will include a global digital compact. So I know there's been a lot of work done already There's a lot of thinking about that in the context of the summit. So what do you think should be in the Global Digital Compact next year in September 2024? What are the big challenges you see and how to address them?
Thank you. So my comments are going to sort of tie together chapters 3 and 4, the Digital Compact and Youth and Future Gen. You know, the starting point for me is that any summit that aspires to be a summit of the future that does not center Africa is starting on a faulty foundation. And I say that not just because I'm Nigerian or African, but just looking at sort of the statistics, the demographics. There's a New York Times article, it's a New York Times series in the last couple of weeks titled "The World is Becoming More African." You know, and they had some very interesting numbers. In 2050, a third of 15 to 24-year-olds in the world will be from Africa. A quarter of the world's population will be African. Even now, the median age on the continent is 19. The global median is 30. You know, so clearly, the 10 billion young people that I think you were talking about who will be born before the end of the century, most of them will come from Africa. So it's, I think that it's important then to start to think about this population and how do you prepare this population for a digital age? How do you get digital skills into the hands of this population? You know, and of course, digital skills, of course, it starts with even internet access. So one has to think about, I guess, things like internet access, high-speed internet access, digital skills, digital literacy. And so the summit, the digital compact that the Summit of the Future is thinking about must have at its heart, at its center, a thinking about what the world will look like in 2050. You know, what the world will look like even in 2030. And so digital skills, internet access, but even also the balance of power that you see in technology. So at the moment, you know, most of what you call big tech is Western. You know, you talk about the big platforms, you know, the Googles and the Amazons and the Facebooks and all of them. And you've got to have, we have to start having conversations about how do we begin to balance or shift the balance of power such that the technology conversation is not dominated by one part of the world. You know, and because there are implications for when technology is limited or technology thinking is limited to one part of the world. It has implications. You know, ChatGPT is big now, artificial intelligence, all of that stuff. These technologies function or are trained on models, you know, which embody certain ways of thinking. They embody cultures. They embody attitudes, languages, all of that. If you do not get if we don't embed equity and equality in how this technology is being conceived and is developing, it's going to have implications for the future. Implications that will further, I think, widen the digital divide. So I think that even from the point of view of big tech, the idea that African countries exist on the periphery, you know, we've got to start to push back against that idea and to invest more in building, I guess, the next generation of, whether it's tech startups, whether it's tech thinkers, you know, people who, you know, civil society, all of that, we have to start thinking about that. So that digital compact, I think, must also embody this. The third thing I want to speak about is disinformation, you know, and what we call information disorders. One of the patterns over the last sort of couple of years is this idea of setting up disinformation farms in places like Ghana and Nigeria. You know, and it's easy to ignore these things until you find out that these disinformation farms are being used to affect elections in places like the US. So for me, the argument about African countries is not, it's an important argument because, the elections in the US, elections in France, in the EU can be affected even by misinformation and disinformation farms that are taking advantage of cheap labor in Ghana, cheap labor in Nigeria. We've seen this happen. So, and that's why that's again why it reinforces the point I'm making about why we must think about like the teeming population of young people on the continent and how we harness that population for internet good as opposed to internet harms. Thank you.
Thank you. Very interesting indeed. There's such a thing that a lot of people are talking about competitive rulemaking. And so it's not just a divide, I think, that we are witnessing. It's also who makes the rules, that we need to, a question that we need to address. But I want to go back to Mr. Ryder and what you said earlier. Isn't it a bad time for reform? Because the world is really polarized and the world is really fragmented right now. And we've heard from Dino, from Alain Leroy also about the North-South divide, for example. But this is not the only one. Of course, there's the US-China competition, and this is, by the way, one of the reasons why we called this edition of the Paris Peace Forum seeking common ground in a world of rivalry, because this competition is now affecting a lot of different areas. So isn't it a bad time to reform the UN when consensus making is so difficult?
The Summit for the Future is a summit for reform of the it's about making the multilateral system fit for purpose. The adjectives that the Secretary General applies is making multilateralism effective, inclusive, and networked. There's something about the different parts of the multilateral system working well together. And why is it now so urgent to have this reform? Well, in the light of what my fellow panelists have said, we are now living at a moment where we have seen the global conditions in which the UN was born and existed for its initial decades, the conditions of the Cold War, which defined how the UN operated. And then that was replaced by years, can we call it, of the US ascendancy? That's gone. And now we have a move towards, I think it might properly be called complex multipolarity, because yes, you have the US-China dynamic, we know all about it, and we know how it plays out, particularly in the field of economics and technology, above all else. When you talk about competitive rulemaking and some of the issues of technology governance, this comes very much to the fore. But you are seeing an extraordinarily complex network of regional, sub-regional, can I call them mid-level powers coming into play. Look at areas of conflict today. Look at the powers that really have had and can have influence in Syria, the conflict in Syria, in Sudan, even in Gaza and Palestine. If you think, you make a list of the countries which have protagonism and influence there, they would not be the countries that you would have thought about a decade ago, I would hazard. That's one part of it. The other part of it is simply the way the global economy is set up and works. I said in my initial comments that the workings of the international financial architecture is going to be a particularly important and difficult subject at the Summit of the Future. A lot of the resentment I see between North and South, if we can call it that, has its origins in the manner in which global trade, global finance operates. It sort of goes under the radar screen a little bit in the light of our many challenges today, that the world is in a desperate debt crisis. The developing world is engulfed in a debt crisis of a severity we haven't seen for decades. And I think a lot of the leaders, African leaders, for example, feel that, frankly, they've been abandoned or they are ill-served by a financial system which allowed and helped some parts of the world recover from the COVID-induced global depression much more quickly than them. So we've got to put these complexities together. I think it is a moment of unparalleled complexity. We have at the same time to overcome dramatic division in the multilateral system. There's no getting away from that. At the same time, there's a need to address genuinely existential challenges to the international community become more acute. Those should be the two factors, I would argue, that should concentrate minds when we go to the Summit of the Future. Is it going to be difficult? Yes. That's precisely why we have to get it done.
Thanks. Really interesting. But picking up on that point, Mr. Leroy, do you agree, actually? And we had this debate yesterday because we had a really interesting panel on the multi-crisis and how multi-crisis combining climate, debt, COVID, and the consequences also of the Ukrainian, the war in Ukraine, especially food security, how this feeds the conflict prevention agenda, right? But there was this debate about whether the heart of the matter is the reform of the international financial architecture or whether it needs to also address the peace and security issue. And in terms of the peace and security debates, don't you think that there is a need to enlarge, to broaden the discussion now on the governance mechanism for peace and security and be more inclusive, especially of countries of the global south, whatever that means? How do you see this discussion on peace and security evolve to become more legitimate?
I agree. I think, as the guy said again, and my other colleague, these days the multilateralism is attacked in many ways because the world is divided, West, South, Global South, and other. At the same time, it's a time where the multilateralism is even more badly needed. That's a paradox. And it's why summit is key. It will be extremely difficult, but at the same time, it must be. No substitute. It is not G20. It is not the BRICS. No one will have the universal view. For example, when you speak about the digital compact, it should be universal. So it's who else is universal as the UN? None. There is regulation within the EU, regulation within the US. And there was an interesting panel yesterday with the president of Microsoft. They have different kind of regulation in the EU and the US, but sometimes they have to converge if we want to be interoperable and to converge under a UN umbrella. There are no other umbrella. Okay. On the peace and security, I think, and as you said, we have to have a more legitimate Security Council, the question of enlargement, the role of the General Assembly. But at the same time, I remember here in that very room in June 2022, so last June, there was the new global financial pact summit proposed by France and President Macron. And one of the main purposes of that summit is to try to bridge a bit the gap between the West and the Global South. Were present in this very room the President of South Africa, President of Brazil, President of Kenya, and many others, and to try to find a solution. And as it was said, clearly one of the ideas is, as for the Security Council, it's very important that the international financial architecture is changed. And we heard, for example, for the last discussion in Marrakesh on the General Assembly of IMF and World Bank, there is a move now to, for example, to have a seat, 25th seat in the IMF for African countries. That's a good progress. But still, we'd go further. There is a debate about the quota within the World Bank and IMF. It's a very good occasion to ensure we have more legitimacy and more role for power who are not even middle, not even when Bretton Woods was created in 1944 and the UN in 1945. That's the key challenge. As you said, it's extremely difficult, but badly needed. And we shall use any occasion, General Assembly, a summit like last June here, or the summit for the future, to sit on the table to see a minimum consensus. Probably we will not have a consensus on all the issue, but fully the summit will have a list of consensus on various themes where we, for example, with China, we know there are some differences, but at the same time, China is a great supporter of the UN in some way, maybe a different UN, but I think we can find a way. Of course, it's a bit more difficult with Russia these days, I would say, because they have some difficulty with the UN Charter, as you said. But I think, and what we see today, very interesting, in these coming days, in the last days, we see John Kerry and the Chinese negotiator for the COP28, again, COP28, again, a UN institution for sure. it's a way that at the same time when there are big differences over many issues, there are discussion at the highest level between China and the US on extremely important issues, climate, but also on conflict resolution.
Thanks. So Dino, what should come first? Security, peace and security reforms, international financial architecture reform, incorporating, I'm glad you mentioned climate, incorporating the challenge of climate change into the multilateral system, because right now it doesn't really have a home, an institutional home. What should come first? And if you could keep your comments to a few minutes, because we have only
first, they all should come together in one package, right? But I want to say something. I'm from Southeast Asia, which was once very divided region. Wars, conflicts, and so on. Yeah? Millions of people died. And now, Southeast Asia is one under ASEAN in peace and relative prosperity. And the reason is statesmanship, right? So what I think is missing in the world system today, right, I appreciate the UN Secretary General's really courageous effort and so on. But the countries that he's leading, especially the major powers, need to show craft and statesmanship. And that's what I'm not seeing much of today. I mean, just one example to add to what Alan has said. Look, you know, China is rising power, right? But it's very difficult if China does something good for any American politicians to commend that or to say so, right? And it doesn't make sense, right? I mean, you know, in an international system, this should be, hey, if you do something not good, criticize. If you do something well, commend, right? But because China bashing is so high in America, in some parts of the Western world, that doesn't happen. And this is why, when we had COVID, the US had their own solution, China had their own solutions, but they couldn't work together. And this is for the human race, right? And on climate change, why is it so difficult when you expect the rest of the world to work together, to be at peace, to cooperate, but among the major powers, because the geopolitical rivalry is so strong that you can't cooperate among yourselves. For us in the Global South, that is very difficult to understand, because like I said, I come from Southeast Asia, a region of wars and division, which through our own act, no thanks from anybody else outside the region, we fix our own problems. And I hope that can be done at the UN level. Yeah.
Thank you very much. And Tolu, last question. What do you think the young people, young generation want? I mean, what do you think the priorities for the young gen, as you called it, is?
You know, I think when you listen to conversations with young people all over the world, you get this sense, and I don't know how validated it's been, but you get this sense that people are not starting out life sort of with the same kinds of opportunities that a generation or two ago started life with. So, you know, even the conversations in the UK, for example, you know, it's about, for example, how difficult it is to get a mortgage, you know, at the age, you know, your 20s, when your parents could almost take it for granted. You know, in Nigeria, you know, there are conversations about how 30 years ago, public schools equalized the rich and the poor, where you could be sure that, you know, in public schools you will find kids of rich people and not so rich people. Today, you know, it's no longer the case. The rich live their own lives, you know, so it's about, I think it's about a loss of opportunity. I think that's what's uppermost in the minds of young people. How do we, you know, actually I'm not that young anymore, so I'm not sure I should use we. How do young people sort of get the same kind of opportunities to start out life as our parents did? Now, the quick flip side to that is that we also have access to incredible technologies and tools that were not available 20, 30 years ago. So the internet, for example, is a big one. You know, I remember when we had one single national telecoms company in Nigeria, and we had to queue, you know, to make phone calls. You know, I remember when I started when I started out writing many years ago, and I had to send stuff by post. I had to send my poems, for example, by post, you know, to a newspaper. All of that has changed. The internet has done a decent job leveling and creating opportunities. So I think it's a blend of both. It's leveling the opportunities, actually, using the internet and I guess all other technological tools that exist.
Thanks a lot. There are, of course, a million questions that we could discuss, but I want to take a few questions from the public, and we have maybe 5 minutes to do that. Yeah, go ahead, and then you.
So I'm Luno Volsi. I am a diplomat at the Haitian Embassy in Paris. My question is for Mr. Leroy. Et I would like to ask a discussion in French, si vous me le permettez, bien entendu. Alors, c'est sur Haïti et sur le métier de la paix.
It's about Haiti and peace and security. As you know, the Haitian issue has been in the UN agenda since the 90s. And when the UN and AIC established a consolidation of peace in the country, but we're observing 30 years later that Haiti is still facing a multi-level crisis, which takes on unprecedented proportions in terms of peace and safety. What do you think, Mr. Leroy, if the UN would adopt an approach in helping to build and consolidate a government in the country that would then be able to maintain peace sustainably instead of operating in a context where the government is not reinforced?
Thank you.
Do you think it could be different?
Maybe we'll take a couple of questions.
Hi. Thank you so much, Nadara Youssef. I'm Executive Coordinator of the Global Governance Innovation Network, but also with Coalition for the UN We Need, and we've been working very closely with USG Ryder's office on the Summit of the Future process. So a couple quick thoughts there. Firstly, the Summit of the Future doesn't really work unless there are women and youth involved in the conversation. It would have been lovely to see more of that on this panel as well. Secondly, in terms of the sort of rule of law and sort of the world order discussion, especially in the negotiations, what we've been seeing is it's not all of G77 pushing back. I think there is a common consensus that we need to have some sort of reform in place. It's been a very small, very vocal minority, and I'd be curious to hear how the panelists think that sort of that can be overcome and consensus can be built cross-regionally. Finally, I don't think it's a case of resentment per se, but rather just a lack of trust, because there's not been gestures of trust in the past that have been sort of set out as precedent. So what's going to happen differently at the Summit of the Future? And finally, civil society participation is so critical and crucial for the support and success of the Summit of the Future. We're involved in putting together a conference in Nairobi on the 9th and 10th of May to facilitate civil society inputs into the Summit of the Future. But critically, you know, especially with closed negotiations happening in the run-up now in the roadmap that was released by Germany and Namibia, I think it'd be great to hear sort of what you think would be important and what member states and yourselves will be doing to facilitate the success of the summit.
Thank you. So perhaps one question for you and one question for Mr. Ryder.
Shall I answer in French? I think je dois répondre en français à monsieur.
I'm going to answer this question in French to the gentleman. It's true that the UN has been present in Haiti for a long time, and it's a catastrophic situation. My point is that the mandate of the mission was to try to reinforce the institutions and the national police in Haiti. The ministry played an important role in the earthquake, and then there was cholera. That was another very serious condition. But little by little, they tried to reinforce the intervention of the state. But we can't take over from the government. Training national police in Haiti and parliamentarians from Haiti have particular relationships with drugs, and the UN can do nothing about that. It's a very important moment in statesmanship. It's very clear. To my way of thinking, the UN started too early when the institutions weren't reinforced enough. There's no army in Haiti, so security is the national police. Very clearly, we've shown that we started too early when the national police did not yet have its full ability. 2 seconds to answer one point.
Maybe one point to answer to you on the question of ASEAN. I think, and you say on statesmanship, you mentioned ASEAN. Of course, the European Union is another extremely good example where statements, okay, de Gaulle, Adenauer, and others were able to overcome the past conflicts. But interesting, when I was in Brussels, at the head of the EU diplomatic service, one day I received a delegation from ASEAN ministers, and they said, we want to have a closer coordination between us. We want to discuss conflict and economic cooperation. And we have looked into the world as an example. And we looked, and the only example which we were interested in was European Union. I think it was interesting to see an example who works, and of course, and those examples could be also some example to be followed at the universal level, if possible. Thank you.
Thank you. Please.
Just to add on Haiti, colleagues will be aware perhaps that there are now moves underway to have a multinational force return to Haiti under the leadership of a number of member states, Kenya in particular. Not a UN force, but a multinational force under authority of the Security Council. Women and youth is fundamentally important to not just the success of the summit, but the relevance and the meaningfulness of the summit. On youth, I have to say that one of the things that's already been done in advance of the Summit of the Future is the establishment of a youth office inside the UN Secretariat. We have an Assistant Secretary General for Youth Matters. This is the Secretary General, I think, putting his money where his mouth is. We now have a much greater capacity to engage with youth. The challenge for the summit will be to make youth participation in UN decision-making and processes systemic and meaningful. I could say some similar things about women and gender. This panel is not a great example of the types of equities we should be pursuing. You're absolutely right. I mentioned perhaps earlier on that in the specifications of the Pact for the Future agreed by the General Assembly, gender is a cross-cutter, it's a transversal. That has advantages and dangers, which we all know about. We have to make sure that is made something real. And you mentioned a word which I think is of fundamental importance, trust. I'm afraid that the reality is that levels of trust, the UN is not immune from low levels of trust in public institutions. I mean, that's the reality of our world. And there's also the problem of trust between countries. We are at low levels of trust and confidence, and that has to be overcome. You're quite right to say that we do not have a rapport de force, a lineup of North and against South or anything like that. You have a great diversity of interests in negotiating positions. It will take a lot of work and confidence building to work that through to a consensus, which is not simply a lowest common denominator. That's the job ahead.
You raise a very important question about civil society. And I know we're all worried about geopolitical rivalries, but I'm optimistic for one reason, Fabienne. You know what it is? During the Cold War, it's the political elite, the government, and the people were determined to be against the other. You know, if you go to any American village, there will be staunchly anti-communist and would be anti-Soviet Union, right? So at every level, that division, that confrontation is there, right? And what happens now, yes, you have rivalry and division between the major powers, but what makes me hopeful is that at the people level, you don't see that, right? I mean, among the athletes, the artists, the students, the entrepreneurs on US, China, Europe, and so on, and they're not so much affected by this rivalry and confrontation. And I think that is a very important difference between what we have today and in the past. And this is why I think any civil society interactions is very useful. My group, we organize what is called the online global town hall. And to our surprise, we had 24,000 participants from 151 countries voluntarily taking part on this. Angel Gurria spoke in that online global town hall, and Paris Peace Forum supported that as well. But I think it's one of the things that give me hope when you don't give the microphone only to the political establishments or officials, but you give more space to civil societies, regardless of whatever political systems they belong to.
Absolutely. Do you want to have the last word, or no? So thank you so much for your contributions. A lot of food for thought. It seems to me that all the issues that we've discussed today are issues that really need better global governance. And this is what we're trying to do here at the Paris Peace Forum, try to have multi-actor discussions that actually address, some of the gaps in global governance. Yes, but the question is whether the system we have will be able to address these gaps or not. And if it doesn't address the gaps that we see at the moment, then of course all the different centers of power, the police centers we see, the different conflict management systems and groupings, regional groupings and so on, are going to continue doing this work, and there will be less and less consensus in the international community. So, Mr. Leroy, you wanted to comment on
just one point to follow what the other were saying. Maybe a call for the civil society. This summit in September 24 will be a summit of head of states, but also representative of civil societies. And so far, my feeling is that this summit is not sufficiently known. We need proposals from the civil society, from women, youth, from every continent. And I think there was the SDG summit, but now the key important, it's a once in a time opportunity to reform the system. We know all the difficulties. I'm sure the OECD from Angoria and others will contribute to that. It's a particularly difficult time, but it's badly needed. And for that, we need the contribution from everyone, civil society and others. It's time to, it's in less than 10 months from now. I think it's important that everyone is eager to make some proposals.
Thank you. So we've come to the end of the discussion. Thank you so much to everybody. Thank you to the public as well.